Chapter 10 Matenge came back to Cholamamimidi in mid-August, and found himself faced with the progress of mankind. Commoners were up and about everywhere, busy like ants, building dams for themselves. They were also laughing and had new language up their sleeves, like cash crops. This sent Matenge into a fuming rage. Barely 10 years ago, the commoner had always to approach a chief or sub-chief and ask him for permission to progress. This desire for progress had usually taken the form of wanting to build a small brick house with a tin roof. But brick houses were for chiefs alone, and how could an ordinary commoner want to bring himself up to the level of a chief? Or again, he might desire to set up a borehole for watering his cattle. The chief could say yes or no. If in some demented mood he said yes, and then the commoner prospered, it would not be for long. This unfortunate man would one day be notified by the chief that a road was to be built in the pathway of his borehole. Would the commoner please quit? And not so many months after that, the chief acquired a new watering hole for his cattle. Although he did not know it, Matenge was a thoroughly cornered rat, partly because his brother was playing football with him, and partly because he was faced with an entirely new situation in Cholamamimidi. There were too many independent-minded people there, and the tragedies of life had liberated them from the environmental control of the tribe. Never before had people been allowed to settle permanently on the land as they were doing in Cholamamimidi. In the not-so-very-bad old days, those who had desired to be permanent farmers had had their huts burned down and been driven back to the villages. So the cheerful paramount Chief Sekoto, who casually broke the rules and needed to possess no man's soul, was perhaps an unconscious assistant of the progress of mankind. But all things are unpredictable under the social structure of African tribalism. It seems to hold within itself terrible and secret currents, which are geared toward eternal enmity of the individuals who stand alone. And who knew if one day Chief Sekoto might not turn demented too and unleash a bombshell of destruction on Cholamamimidi. Matenge's crises were always slightly prepared. No one ever knew what was going on in that lonely mountain top which was his soul. The village was just presented with his thunderstorms, and their fierceness and savage intensity were the outcomes of months of brooding. But he was ailing these days, and it took him longer than usual to find his new victim. His dizzy spells alarmed him, and he spent many hours quietly relaxing on his porch in his royal purple dressing-gown, where he kept his servants dancing up and down in attendance of his needs. Being only servants and anxious to please him, they also kept him informed of all the developments in the village. The name of Paulina Sabeso was frequently mentioned by the servants. Yet, at this time, a far greater crisis than any Matenge could ever produce was to strike down on the village of Cholamamimidi and the country as a whole. It all began so quietly. The weather was the usual for this time of year. That is, from mid-August to mid-September, the country was suddenly and abruptly plunged into the most intense and stifling heat. Scorched winds, too, blew in from the west, bringing with them huge, swirling columns of red desert dust. All this misery was welcomed. The intense heat precipitated the first summer downpour. The old people and cattlemen knew this, and they remained contented in the swirling dust and heat. They never had any calendars, but when they looked towards the sky, they knew it was September, the month when the rain clouds gathered. No matter that this was a country of 2 years of good rain and 7 years of drought, the rain clouds always gathered in September. But September came around, and no rain clouds gathered in the sky. At the cattle posts, far out in the bush, the spade-dug wells were drying up, But still the cattlemen were not unduly worried. The huge, hulking, cavernous-bodied russet-brown Swana cow was a strange beast. No one seemed to know of its origin, but everyone knew of its adaptation to the hazards of local climatic conditions, and of its ability to go for long periods without food or water. Man and beast had always lived this way. If there was no food or water for a man, then there was none for his cattle either. Both were as close to each other as breathing, and it had never been regarded as strange that a man and his cattle lived the same life. No doubt the cattlemen who lived in the lonely, isolated cattle posts at first stared in disbelief when their cattle began dropping dead before their very eyes. There were always droughts. There had been many in each man's lifetime, but never in the memory of man had the cattle dropped dead. By the time the men panicked, hundreds and thousands of cattle had died. The truth was, no one knew what to do, and the authorities, who by this time were becoming aware of the extent of the tragedy that had taken place in the bush, had no way of establishing communication with the thousands of men at the isolated, unmapped cattle stations. Eventually, all the cattlemen were to be driven out of the bush, overcome by thirst, each trailing behind a few emaciated beasts. But they were a reasoning, steady crowd, these cattlemen. They moved slowly and thought slowly, often with a quiet humor. It was reasonable to them that the vultures should gather above a man's cattle post, for who could bury all these cattle which were dying daily? They watched in calm apprehension as one beast after another toppled dead to the ground. This was reasonable too. When had the dry season ever spanned 10 long months? The rain of the previous year had all fallen in November. There had been a day in November when the sky had emptied itself in one long, angry downpour. Then all the rain had fled away. But the lack of rain had not troubled the cattlemen. They had their wells along silted-up river beds, where the water flowed underground all year round. True enough, the grazing had been burned bone-dry by the hot January sun. But they had an ancient belief that bone-dry grazing was better for their cattle than fresh green grass, wet with dew. Now, nodding their heads, they slowly absorbed a new truth. If cattle ate bone-dry grass for 10 months, a day would arrive when all cattle would drop down dead. Once they reached this point in their reasoning, all the cattlemen picked up their long sticks and began driving what was left of their herds back to the villages, to arrive there with ghastly tales of how the bush was one big graveyard. But the vultures are feasting, they added humorously. The first wave of cattlemen who had exhausted their reasoning powers arrived in the village of Kholamamidi in the late afternoon. They hastily erected kraals for their cattle with thorn bush and instructed their wives to water the cattle sparingly. Then they retired to the yard of one of their fellows, and all sat in a circle on wooden stools, silently drinking bowls of sour milk porridge. Disaster had indeed struck down swiftly on their small world, and each man sat in a mountain of aloof reserve to prevent his fellow from starting the sorrowful tale. My friend, I had 200 cattle just yesterday. Out of this, 120 have died, and I have just counted the beasts. I now have 80. They had seen the bush strewn with dead cattle on their way home. No one had stopped to look behind at the weak cows that had lain down to calf and die in the process of giving birth. The one thought in each man's mind had been to hasten home, even if he only had one beast left. Cattlemen could talk about this with humor and resignation to any other person but one of their fellows. It was not long before the group of silent men was joined by that super-reasoner, Dinarego. He came into the yard with his cheerful shuffle, holding on to the remnants of his tattered coat. The men moved aside immediately. They respected and trusted no one more deeply than Dinarego. Once the old man had seated himself, The owner of the yard, a tall, taciturn man named Roncoane, threw the stiff, dried carcass of a small wild buck into the circle of men. "Look what I have found, my friend," Roncoane said. "It's not only the cattle which are dying." The big dark eyes of the little animal were wide open, and he lay on his side with his 4 delicate legs stretched out stiffly, just the way the cattle lay when they drop down dead. The men stared at it in fascination, really seeing death for the first time. They could not bear to look on their cattle in this posture of death. Roncoane enjoyed this effect. He enjoyed the contemplation of death, and was one of the few men who could stare at it boldly. He bent down and removed the carcass and threw it to one side. Dinarego nodded his head several times profoundly. "We have received this news some days ago," he said. "The news came by phone to my son Gilbert. It was the police officer, George Appleby Smith, who phoned. He said, 'Gilbert, do you know of the way cattle and wild beasts are dying in the bush?' And Gilbert said, 'I am not surprised. Look at how it rained last year, all on one day in November.' I was present when this phone call came, and my son Gilbert put down the phone, struck with pity. My heart, too, was struck with pity. I said, 'The good Lord has prevented me from keeping something which dies.'" The men looked at Dinarego with deep interest. The mention of the name Gilbert had suddenly filled their hearts with hope, where before had been a passive resignation. No one had any clear idea of why he had headed home except that it seemed the most reasonable thing to do. But they were all members of the cattle cooperative and greatly prided themselves on having joined this new and strange association. Perhaps Gilbert, who had new ideas each day, would tell them what to do with all the cattle they could no longer feed. "What has Gilbert to say about the deaths?" one of the men prompted tentatively. Dinarego looked at the men triumphantly. "The rain has not come," he said, "but still we will plough. Come, let us go and see Gilbert." With one abrupt gesture, the men put down their porridge bowls and stood up. Roncoane's wife, who was watering the cattle nearby, looked at them in amazement. They looked like men about to go into battle. So stern and concentrated were their expressions. Just as they were about to leave the yard, Paulina Sabeso approached them. She clasped her hands politely together in greeting, but she was wild with anxiety. She fixed her eyes on Roncoane. "Please spare a moment, Roncoane," she said. "I want to ask you something." Roncoane detached himself from the group and walked towards her with his angry-looking expression. Roncoane was always rude and offhand to women. "What is it?" he asked impatiently. "Your cattle post is near mine," Paulina said. "Why didn't you persuade my son to come home with you? What's the good of him staying in the bush where there is no water and the cattle are dying?" A queer, guarded look crept on Roncoane's eyes. "So your son has not come home, Paulina Sabeso?" he asked quietly. "I don't understand you, Roncoane," she said wildly. "What are you saying?" The man shrugged. He had more than enough troubles to bear. His own livelihood had almost vanished before his very eyes. "I told your son to go home 2 weeks ago," he said. "I expected him to be here. That's why I did not stop at your cattle post today." He walked away to join the group of men, but then he turned round once again and looked at Paulina with a twisted expression of pain on his face. At the same time, he was trying to escape responsibility by not telling the woman why he had ordered her son home 2 weeks previously. It must have been just about this time, too, after he had brought the cattle back to the kraal for the night, that Paulina's son had come to him. "I don't know what's wrong with me, uncle," the boy had said. "I'm coughing up blood every day." But Roncoane knew at one glance what was wrong. Tuberculosis was the main killer in the country, and the small boy, with his red, feverish eyes, was seriously ill with it. Also, the diet they were eating now, plain porridge with salt and water and no milk, must have brought the boy's ailment to a serious stage. Ronquane merely smiled because he did not want to alarm the boy, who looked like a thin, bony scarecrow in his father's oversized jacket. "We are all coughing," he said. "The reason why? There is too much dust and no rain to settle it. Dust in the lungs causes one to cough up blood. The one way to cure it is by drinking beer. But since you are too young and cannot drink beer, you must go home tomorrow with the cattle, and your mother will take you to the hospital." The boy grinned at him cheerfully, with big white teeth. He was amused at Ronquane's reference to beer and the man-to-man tone of his voice. Still, he was worried. He could not take the cattle back to the village and burden his mother with them. "Can't I leave the cattle in your care until I come back from the hospital, uncle?" he asked. Ronquane had shifted uncomfortably. He was now drawing up half a bucket of water from his well, and he could not add to his own worries. Besides, Paulina Sabeso was a resourceful woman, and she would know what to do. He explained this to the boy, who nodded. The last thing he would get from his mother was a scolding. She made a joke of life, and he already knew what she was going to say when he unexpectedly arrived home. "Goodness, Isaac, you didn't tell me you had eaten up all your rations," she would say. "No, mamma, I've come home early because I'm coughing up blood every day." This would most surely strike his mother as unusual, as she would not know of Ronquane's story about the dust in his lungs. The thought of his mother and her surprise and concern filled the small boy's heart with warm comfort. He stood up and walked back happily to his own roughly built hut, and it was the memory of this last conversation he had had with the boy that made Ronquane look back at Paulina Sabeso with a pained expression. He ought not to have done so, for his look froze Paulina to the ground, and she could not move, so lifeless and numb was the feeling in her arms and legs. Several times Ronquane's wife called to her, after the man had walked away. Eventually, she put the bucket down and walked over to Paulina. "I say, my friend, what's the matter?" asked Ronquane's wife. Paulina looked at Ronquane's wife almost bitterly. Women who had husbands made the deep well of her own loneliness more acute to her. "I'm thinking of going to the cattle post tomorrow to fetch my son," she said. "My, but you are brave, Paulina Sabeso," the other woman said. "I hear that the bush is now full of dangerous beasts who are feasting off of the dead cattle." Paulina Sabeso stared at Ronquane's wife. People in comfort and safety said things like this to people who always faced storms and winters of life. "You're a silly fool, Segametse," she said, and walked away with her head held up proudly. But halfway to her own home she almost dropped it to the ground in despair, and so hangdog and depressed was she that she nearly collided into Micaiah, who stood at the entrance of her yard, looking out towards the smeared, murky red glow which was the sunset. "Oh, Micaiah," she said, looking up at him with a taut, strained face, "my whole life is turned upside down." "It's nothing," he said, smiling down at her. "The boy is young. It wouldn't occur to him to come home with the cattle. We'll go together to the cattle post tomorrow, and bring him and the cattle back to the village." And that was all he said before walking away, back to the farm. There was nothing else he offered her except his kindness and help. On other days she had questioned this relentlessly because he kept it unrelated to any human feeling. He seemed to ignore the fact that he awakened a fire in someone else's life with his generosity, but on this day it lifted the weight off her arms and legs. He had not even asked her, as Ronquane had done, if her son had come home, but had simply produced immediate solutions to her trouble. This filled her eyes with a quiet, wondering look. Yet Micaiah could have ended this odd game with a gesture or a few words or even a look. He knew how much Paulina Sabeso loved him, but still he hesitated. He would not have liked it if Paulina had given up and stopped loving him, because it was like a warm sun on all the shadows of his life. It was just that there were things he could not put into words, that a woman's life was a clutter of small everyday things, of babies, gossip, pots, food, fires, cups, and plates, and that all these things had crashed into his consciousness during the month he had worked on the dams and tobacco sheds with the women. Micaiah walked into the farmyard just as the cattlemen were rising from their discussion with Gilbert. They looked at Micaiah curiously with his strange, strongly marked facial bone structure. They had yet to learn from their wives about the tobacco project and the dams that were being built to trap some of the storm water, but on this evening there was no time for introduction to the stranger. The sight and sound of their cattle crashing dead on the ground were still full in the men's eyes, and they walked away with the heavy tread of people who were grieved beyond consolation. Micaiah turned and looked at his friend Gilbert and started in surprise. He knew Gilbert so well by now that he could judge his every mood, and on this evening he was in a mood of high elation, even though he kept his face quite serious and listened attentively to Dinarego, who was summing up the situation for him. Dinarego was saying, "We can progress, too, even though we are uneducated men. The mind of an uneducated man works like this. He is a listener and a believer. Most of all, he is a believer. The uneducated man has been condemned for many years by the authorities. They came to us and said, 'We have found new grazing land in the west. Move the cattle over there, because the eastern side has no more grazing left.' Yet no one moved. The west is lion country. Some time ago people were eaten by lions, and that is enough. This is a belief in our minds that we will be eaten by lions, therefore we cannot go west. Today, once all the cattle have died, the authorities will say, 'You see, we told you.' But it is strange to me that they did not create the belief that the uneducated men could shoot the lions." He paused and looked at the two men with his shrewd, twinkling eyes, and both men burst out laughing. It was only a pity that Dinarego was not the Prime Minister of Botswana, as no one could defeat his reasoning power or his faith in progress. He also liked an audience, and spread out his hands appreciatively and continued, "Nearly every agriculture man knows about the progress of an uneducated man. They are always coming to us and saying, 'Look, I can show you how to plow 80 morgen of sorghum.' Once he has produced the field of 80 morgen, the uneducated man will be consumed by jealousy and try to do the same. What he sees, he believes, but he never questions a matter like an educated man. The miracle must be placed before his eyes, then he will try to perform a miracle too." Gilbert looked at the old man intently, the blue flame of elation dancing brightly in his eyes. "What would you say if I said that the deaths of all those cattle in Holemamidi are a miracle? What would you say if I said I was hoping for it to happen?" he asked. The old man kept deadly silent as he suspected a trap in these unexpected words of Gilbert, and Micaiah leaned forward with interest, as he was now about to hear the reason for the suppressed excitement of his friend. Gilbert raised his hands like a gambler who foresees only the gains that will come without any losses. He had 3 years of research and experiments behind him, but the cattle population of Holemamimidi had been too huge and unwieldy for his plans. For planned and scientific production of high-grade beef, he needed a drastically reduced herd. He also needed the men near the food-growing areas where beef production and food production could be combined. He had everything on hand, too, the latest developments in fodder crops for cattle feed and silage making, and his own experiments with the natural grasses of Botswana and improved grass seed. To the cattlemen he had merely presented the government's emergency plans for dealing with the situation, and these were that there was to be an accelerated slaughter of the emaciated beasts at the abattoir. These emaciated beasts would be boiled down into corned beef. This slaughter of cattle would bring in about 10 pounds per cow for each man, which was better than nothing at all, and it was designed to relieve the situation until free emergency rations would arrive in about 1 month's time. Thus each man would contribute so many head of cattle from his herd, and those who were left would be kept alive for 1 month on the fodder in the farm silage pits. The men had agreed to this arrangement. They had also agreed to retain within the cooperative a certain sum of money they received for the wholesale slaughter of the cattle. This would act as an incentive to the cattlemen to recoup from their losses and restock their herds. He also told the men that since they had an organized cattle cooperative in their village, the government had already agreed to drill a free borehole whose equipment and management would in future be taken over by the cooperative. This was all he had told them, but to Micaiah and Dinarego, on whom he depended for the fulfillment of his dreams, he allowed his mind to leap ahead to 3 years from that date, when all the thick forests of thornbush that surrounded Hulamamimidi had given way to acres and acres of cultivated fields, on which crops grew, under irrigation, the year round. Hulamamimidi would have about 10 to 12 boreholes and reservoirs by that time, and as many more big dams to hold back every drop of storm water. And he willed his 2 companions to see it, how Hulamamimidi would supply the whole country with the fresh fruit and vegetables it lacked, and apart from bringing in the highest profits for the best grade beef, it would also create the first industries in the country. Why, he had already picked up a cigarette manufacturer and made him sign a contract to buy tobacco grown by the Hulamamimidi Tobacco Growing Cooperative, and this manufacturer was already building a factory in northern Botswana. People have said to me, "Oh, forget farming in this dry country," he said intensely. "I've kept my mouth shut all these years, but my eyes have taught me that Botswana is a farmer's heaven. It's better than countries with high rainfall. Farming under irrigation is controlled and predictable farming. Also, the long dry season is more suited to crops like potatoes and tobacco, which need well-drained soil. We've a minimum of crop-destroying pests to deal with too, and the soil is rich and fertile." He looked at Micaiah with his eyes full of dreams, because Micaiah had proved himself the magician who could make tobacco cooperatives appear overnight. He wanted Hulamamimidi to be cooperative in everything, as that was the only way of defeating the land tenure system in the tribal reserves, and the only way of defeating subsistence agriculture, which was geared to keep the poor man poor until eternity. Micaiah smiled back quietly and affectionately at his friend. He liked this kind of talk. He liked the idea that the whole of Hulamamimidi would be full of future millionaires. It blended in with his own dreams about Africa, because he could not see it other than as a continent of future millionaires, which would compensate for all the centuries of browbeating, hatred, humiliation, and worldwide derision that had been directed to the person of the African man. And communal systems of development, which imposed cooperation and sharing of wealth, were much better than the dog-eat-dog policies, take over bids, and grab what you can of big finance. Therefore, in Micaiah's mind, the poverty and tribalism of Africa were a blessing if people could develop sharing everything with each other. "I like everything you say, Gilbert," he said with deep feeling. He looked at the old man, who always had the last word on everything. But Dinarego kept silent. He was regretting that the world had decided to improve itself only when he had become such an old man with a few years left to live. Now, each time he decided he would rest in peace, he kept on learning more about life, and he was not feeling so contented about dying. I'm going to the cattle post tomorrow, Micaiah said, breaking the silence. Gilbert and the old man looked at him in surprise. These were the familiar words of a Botswana man, but they sounded strange on Micaiah's lips. Micaiah wanted to laugh out loud at their surprise. He felt no desire whatsoever to own these huge beasts. They would be an intolerable encumbrance to him. Hesitantly, he explained that he had promised Paulina that he would accompany her to her cattle post to see if everything was all right with her son. The boy may be ill, he said. She expected him to come home with someone named Ronkowane, whose cattle post is near hers, but he says the boy should have arrived home 2 weeks ago. Ronkowane says the wells have dried up. It chilled Gilbert to hear this, and he felt a sharp stab of pain at the way he had light-heartedly talked of scientific beef production amidst all this tragedy. "Mac, you know it's a whole day's walk to the cattle posts," he said. "The 3 of us will leave first thing in the morning with the Land Rover. I also want to see for myself what is happening in the bush." He looked across at Micaiah with all the elation gone out of his eyes. His mind had jumped too far ahead into the future, but the present was painful and terrible. "I hope the boy is only ill," he said. "He may be dead." Micaiah said nothing, yet once Maria came out of the hut and called the 3 men to eat, his stomach was just tight, painful knots, and he excused himself and walked away to his hut. He lay down for some time in his hut, in the darkness, with a strange sensation of having no thoughts in his head, only to discover, with an explosive shock, that he had been talking to himself all the time. He had no idea of what he had been saying to himself, because it was an incoherent expression of the concentration of pain inside him. What sort of man was he who only gave way to love under extreme pressure and pain? Perhaps he had read somewhere, men and women just loved each other without reason or purpose, but he did not belong to this world, not when everything inside him was in revolt. If he loved Paulina now and admitted it to himself, it was because he sensed that she might be facing tragedy, and that she could not face it alone. He swung his leg off the bed, stood up, and walked out of the dark farm to the house of Paulina Sebeso. There was complete darkness in her yard, as she was already in bed. He knocked on the door of the hut she used as a bedroom. "Who is it?" she called, as she was not yet asleep. "Micaiah," he said quietly. She was silent a while, then jumped out of bed and unlocked the door. He could not even see her face in the pitch-dark night, and there was still this struggle within his aloof self, so uncertain was he of life. "Gilbert will also be coming to the cattle post tomorrow," he said, oddly, excusing himself because he was about to invade her life through his fear of tomorrow. She still kept silent, half wanting to laugh and half wanting to cry. Then she closed her eyes to add to this darkness, because nothing that you said seemed quite so bad when everything was dark. "Micaiah," she said softly, "you mustn't think I'm a cheap woman, but I love you." "Why cheap?" he said, amused. "There are no cheap women. Even those you buy love you, while we men rarely do. Perhaps I'll find out what love is like as we go along together." Micaiah was thankful, too, for the dark as he entered her hut. For so long there was this grey graveyard in which he had lived, and who could tell what ghosts really do when they come alive in the dark night?